Oh, Terraria. Truly a timeless classic. I mean, this game still has a massive, passionate player base and has gotten updates for over a decade past its release. Those two things alone cements its place as one of the greatest games of all time. And if you're an RNG-fueled little loot goblin like I am, it'll hook you fast. Progressing through the game and taking on all those pesky big baddie boss fights is only possible by steadily upgrading your gear and equipment, of course. Armor is one thing, sure, but depending on your class, you'll need to hunt down new swords, spell books, even yo-yos of all things for some people. But if you're like me and lean hard into a ranged build, then you're gonna need the guns. And listen, I know you're probably new to the channel. Hello. Subscribe, by the way, please. But I love guns in games, and Terraria certainly delivers. Some of the gun designs in this game are so cool. Like, this one is literally a shark with a minigun jammed down its gullet. So, awesome. But here's the thing. I don't just love guns in games and the creative way they can be represented both visually and functionally in the gameplay. I really love and enjoy 3D modeling them too. So I thought, alright, what if I tried bringing some of Terraria's guns to life in full 3D? And so I did. And for the most part, I'm actually really impressed with how they came out. Especially that last one. I mean, just, wow. Like, I impressed myself with that one, really. But no spoilers, you'll just have to stick around to see that. So, let's go. Let's make some models. I figured we'd start out with the simplest of the three models I created, the quad-barreled shotgun. Before jumping into the modeling, let me quickly explain a few things that apply not just to this model, but to all of them. When creating 3D models of guns or weapons, whether for games or really any medium, starting out with a reference image is pretty standard. Ideally, you'd use a flat image with at least a clear side profile to block out the basic geometry. Even better is having front, back, and top views, which gives you more visual information, like how parts are shaped, separated, their depth, and even some rough dimensions. But Terraria, of course, is pixel art. Our only real reference are those tiny sprites. And sure, the sprite gives us that much needed side view, but there's very limited visual data. You only have so many pixels to work with, so depth, silhouette details, and even the intended materials are often pretty ambiguous. Now, because the quad-barreled shotgun is a more simplified concept, I mean, it's a shotgun, after all, and those tend to be more straightforward than rifles or like sci-fi blasters, we can get away with just using the original sprite. Later in the video with the other two weapons, I'll show you how I cleaned up the reference art using vector shapes to help better plan the model, but for this one, we're good to go straight from the sprite. I import the sprite into Plasticity and set its material to be transparent and front-facing. That way, as I start drawing shapes and building geometry, I'm not blocking the reference underneath. Basically, don't model yourself into a corner. From here, I start outlining shapes using curves and lines, starting with the handle. Since it's mostly curved, it takes a bit of tweaking to get it to look and feel just right. Once the profile is dialed in, I extrude it into a solid and center it on an axis. That gives me a very reliable middle point to build off from, which is super helpful for symmetrical work, and firearms are typically very symmetrical. Normally, I'd block out all the main components before beveling anything, but in this case, I knew the grip needed aggressive bevels to feel like something you could actually hold, so I decided to knock it out pretty early on. That turned out to be a good call, but it didn't make things easy. Even without other geometry in the way, I was having trouble getting clean bevels. Pushing the shape too far caused faults in the geometry and canceled the bevel operation. That's the risk with aggressive bevels. To fix it, I sliced off the front edge of the grip to isolate the problem area, applied the bevel cleanly, and then rebuilt that front section by copying its edge lines into a new face, extruding it, and merging it back into the grip. Next up, the receiver, or more accurately, the section housing the four barrels, where the shells would sit, fire, and, theoretically, eject from. With the reference being pixelated, I had to make a decision. Do I model this like a large, rounded cylinder, or take some inspiration from real-life quad-barreled shotguns and go more with a rounded square kind of shape? I went with the latter. It took a bit of time to get the proportions right, but eventually I landed on a shape I liked, and, just like the grip, I beveled its edges now, since the rounded feel is part of the identity, not just a finishing detail. And now, the barrels. All 4 of them. I spent a good chunk of time figuring out spacing. They needed to be evenly distributed around the receiver without overlapping or being too tight, especially since I knew I'd need room later for things like the chambers and support brackets. Once positioned correctly, I extruded each barrel to match the length of the original artwork. Then came the support frames, those 2 bars that appear in front of the barrels in the pixel art. These aren't just decoration or like flat posts on each side. They're actually structural frames that hold the barrels in place, again, definitely inspired by real-world counterparts. After that, I created new cylinder solids to match the barrel bore size and used those to cut clean holes into the barrels. Gotta have some way to shoot, after all. I repeated that same process with the support brackets so the barrels could pass through cleanly instead of looking jammed in and then in turn blocking the barrels once again. At this point, the weapon's core silhouette was done, so I started adding the smaller, but still critical, components. I modeled the trigger and trigger guard, keeping it simple: outline, extrude, bevel. I also took time here and there to scan the model and make quality of life tweaks, like beveling sharp edges, refining curves, bouncing between components as needed. One of those tweaks was to the grip again. I wanted it to feel like something you could hold, so I tried cutting into it. I didn't love how it worked, and the bevels weren't working the way I wanted them to, so I ended up going the other way and added a raised section instead and beveling that into the proper shape. Now onto the more technical parts. Even though this model is relatively grounded compared to the more fantasy-inspired ones, I didn't want to leave the internals totally unexplained. I'm not trying to engineer a functioning shotgun here, but I do want the model to suggest how it might work. So I started carving out where the shells would sit inside the receiver. Cutting from the back wasn't an option. The grip was in the way. So I imagined each shell dropping, or I guess also being lifted, into angled cutouts on the corners of the receiver. Then I built out some interior walls for those shells to rest against, so they weren't just kind of floating. But this introduced a new issue: gravity. The top chambers were fine, but the bottom ones, they'd need some kind of support to keep the shells from just falling out. And since I didn't want the top and bottom chambers to be designed differently, I added internal support blocks across all 4. Then came the logic issue. How do these supports move to let the shells in and out? I started sketching it out with 4 little solid blocks meant to represent some kind of operatable part, I guess like levers or rotating paddles. I didn't finish the idea here, but I left it in place as a concept to revisit after some more visual polish. So I moved on to adding the front and rear sights, plus a long top rail that connects the front support bracket to the rear one, and finally, the receiver itself. This isn't part of the original artwork, but I wanted the sights to align properly, and it added some extra visual weight. There are times when you can make some creative liberties on how you want to represent a model from a reference image, especially in the case of pixel art, where again, our visual data is very much limited. From here, it was all about adding final polish, so things like rivets, screws, detailing on the receiver, and eventually finalizing the loading mechanism. I ended up going with a solution that isn't exactly realistic, but works. 4 little winged paddles that could be, in theory, rotated or depressed down or lifted or whatever, I guess, to release the support blocks inside. Once that was done, I called the model finished and pulled it into Blender for materials, lighting, and that beautiful rendering. And here's the final result: quad-barreled shotgun from Terraria, brought to life in 3D. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. It's definitely the simplest of the 3 models, so don't worry, things are going to get much more intricate from here. but I think it strikes a nice balance between feeling grounded in reality, almost like some obscure prototype from firearms history, while still clearly being inspired by a fantasy world like Terraria. Alright, that's one done. Let's move on to the next model. Next up, the Vortex Beater. This is a cool little, well, I guess not little, but sci-fi energy-based assault rifle that's definitely a step up in complexity from the quad-barreled shotgun. Because of the extra visual detail in the design, I started by creating a cleaner reference in Illustrator. I traced over the original sprite with some basic vector shapes, adding edges and corners where it made sense. It's not super detailed, but it helps clarify the structure and makes the modeling process smoother. I then brought both the original sprite and my cleaned up reference into Plasticity, so I could look between them as needed. To start, I modeled the glowing barrel that runs through the middle of the weapon. I knew this component would extend all the way from the back to the front, so I wanted to get it in place early. It's much easier to cut into geometry later than trying to wrap parts around something you didn't plan for. With the barrel in place, I built the surrounding casing, I guess, or outer framing, added a placeholder muzzle, and blocked out the bottom structural frame thing, which the front grip would attach to. That grip, naturally, came next, so I shaped it as a rounded rectangle, cut it to slide cleanly onto the frame, and aggressively beveled all the edges to make it look very comfortable and just cozy and soft to hold. Then I moved on to the top and bottom receiver, I guess, thingy components. It's hard to name these parts when it's a sci-fi design. I used the vector reference I made to guide the angled shapes and kind of just blocked them in roughly for now so I could get the spacing right. Next was the handle. I wasn't happy with how I represented it in the vector reference I made, so I took another look at the original sprite and redesigned it. I added a flared bottom and a more squared off M1911 style trigger that gets pressed in directly horizontally as opposed to that kind of classic, just lightly curved trigger design. This did come with its own challenges though, as I realized the entire handle and trigger portion just looked too cramped up to the bottom receiver, and it didn't give off the feeling it would be comfortable to hold and use. So I modeled the handle slightly again to allow it to sit further back from the bottom receiver while still connecting back to it, and I think that solved this issue very nicely, giving the trigger much more breathing room. Back to the receivers, I beveled their key edges and adjusted nearby geometry to stay aligned. With most of the major components in place, the only remaining challenge was that back of the barrel. In the sprite, there's this weird, glowing swoop that connects to the handle, which really stumped me because I wasn't sure what the original artists were trying to represent here, and adding a solid like that to the back of the handle would make it look very unwieldy and just uncomfortable. So I reimagined it as a flexible tube that connects from the back of the weapon to the base bottom of the grip, carrying in it the flowing energy goo source material stuff that's present all over the weapon. Using a simple curve and Plasticity's wire tool, I created a clean conduit between the two ports. A subtle change that actually worked out really well, and I'm pretty proud of it and happy I came up with that idea. From here, I added a solid inside the open barrel section for the glowing energy core thing, and cleaned up the muzzle, and made sure it was properly cut out so the gun could actually fire. Although I do end up returning to the muzzle again anyways, but regardless, I carried on. Then came the small glowing inserts shown in the sprite. I added these to the grip and bottom receiver using really basic, just rectangle solids, arrays, and mirrored cuts, followed by beveled inserts, and then additional solids fitted back into those slots I just cut. I then headed up to the top receiver to add its glowing detailed bits like I did to the bottom receiver and front grip, but suddenly got a burst of creative inspiration. What if it was a futuristic scope? I liked the concept so much, I put a pause on adding those detailed parts and instead started creating the optic attributes I wanted to add to this top receiver part. I added a recessed, display screen to the back and modeled a kind of tech unit to the front, loosely inspired, I guess, by like rangefinders you can sometimes find on marksman rifles. It gave the weapon a cool sci-fi personality and visually seemed like a good fit. It's creative liberties like these that are so fun to take advantage of because we're no longer constrained to limited pixels and have so much more room to experiment with how a weapon like this could actually operate or function. After a few final detail passes and some edge tweaks that I won't go into too much detail now that you kind of see how this process works, I finally brought it into Blender for materials and rendering. And here's the final result. The Vortex Beater, modeled and reimagined in full 3D. I definitely learned a lot from this model, mainly that I haven't quite nailed the rhythm of sci-fi design just yet. I'm still really happy with it and how it turned out, but looking back, I think it could have used a few extra touches to push the detail further. Maybe some small wires, buttons, vents, or heat exhausts. Stuff like that doesn't come as naturally to me yet, since most of my experience and just practice is in modeling more grounded, traditional, real-world firearms. That being said, it's still a strong final result, and with that, let's keep things moving and jump into the final model, because this thing, I cannot wait for you guys to see this. Let's get into it. And now, finally, the Venus Magnum. This one was an instant pick for me. It's just such a sick design. Like a heavy revolver hand cannon with glowing green plant-like energy running through the chamber and bullets. Come on, that's so cool. Just like with the Vortex Beater, I created a refined reference image based on the sprite, which helped me spot some key visual details early on. Like how the barrel actually rests on a swooped forward frame thing that hugs it from either side with these posts. Little things like that are really easy to miss, but really helped when reimagining these weapons in 3D. Anyways, let's model it. And we are going to run through this one faster than the rest because I'm sure you guys get the gist by now, and I'll be perfectly honest, I just want to show off the render at the end as fast as possible. It's very cool. All right, let's go. Let's get to it. I kicked things off by modeling that forward barrel support, starting with the base, extruding it, and then building the barrel on top, and the two side posts that hug it, I guess. I cut fitting grooves to slot the barrel into place, then jumped to the cylinder. The cylinder is one of the most important parts visually. I didn't want it to look too basic, so instead of a smooth, round, like cylinder shape that you typically see on revolvers, I used a high-sided polygon to give it a little bit more edge, literally and stylistically. I added 6 evenly spaced chambers using cylinders, then cut angled windows into them so the glowing bullets would be visible from the sides of the cylinder without actually falling out the side. That added a ton of character to this part. Next, I added the rotating rod that runs through the center and supports the cylinder. Again, keeping with that angled polygon shape for consistency rather than a straight dowel shape or cylinder. Moving backward, I blocked out the face that connects to the handle and then roughed out the handle itself. Like our previous models, I beveled it very aggressively in order to give it that kind of comfortable grip feel all around. I added a top rail connecting the back of the weapon to the barrel, both to unify the silhouette and add some detail and depth to the model, but also so I had a place to seat the front and rear sights later on. I also modeled a sloped, solid piece going from the top of the handle to the back face that's behind the cylinder, and this is kind of acting as a visual hammer strike zone where the hammer will eventually come down when fired, and also helps connect everything together cleanly. After that, I added the trigger, very simple trigger, and modeled a stylized revolver hammer using a photo reference for proportions. I didn't follow the reference image of the hammer one-to-one because I didn't want it to look exactly like a real hammer. I still wanted there to be some elements of fantasy or whatever, make it feel unique. From here, I did several detail passes, bevels, cut-ins, rivets, screws. I also made some pretty major noticeable cuts and beveled into parts of the frame of the weapon, where I would then insert new solids, and those were where I was going to apply the material to make them look like the glowing green parts of the weapon. The last big challenge I had to tackle here was the bullets. See, based on the reference image, they're a pretty important part of the visual aspect of this weapon, and they needed to glow and be visible from the side even when in the cylinder. That being said, I didn't want the entirety of the bullets to just be a glowing material. You'd probably lose a lot of detail in there. So I had to use some layered geometry to make sure once I pulled it into Blender for material and rendering, I had some other solids I could apply, say, like metal textures to. I did a ton more of polishing from here. Again, some more minor cuts and bevels and tweaks across the entire model, but you don't need to hear about every tiny bit, and we've done this a few times now. So let's pull it into Blender, get this bad boy all materialed up, and prepare ourselves for the coolest 3D render you've ever seen. Hopefully. I think it's cool. All right, let's take a look. I am so proud of this model and how it turned out. I hope I didn't hype it up too much and ruin it, but from the geometry and the shaping of the model to the texturing, showing off glowing green organic components and hammered metal for the frame as if it was made with crude tools but expert perfection in an underground jungle cave. Just wow, I really do love this thing. And to be honest, I'm happy with all three of them. I had a blast making these. It was a fun challenge translating low-res pixel art into high-detail models, and I'm pretty happy with how they all turned out. Especially that last one. I mean, come on. If you enjoyed this and want to see me make more 3D models and stuff like that, please subscribe. I am new to this, but already have new videos planned out ahead with the current plan to release a new video every week. And even some shorts sprinkled throughout to keep you going while you wait for the next awesome video. Also, seriously, comment and let me know if there's anything you want to see me model, whether it's guns from old games or real life weapons you want to see modeled. Throw it out there. Thanks a ton again for watching, and now go play some Terraria. And I swear to God, if any of you get upset in the comments I didn't make the mini shark, I don't want to hear it, because that thing has way too many curves and weird geometry, and I will never, ever tackle that headache of a mod.